The wind coming off Lake Erie that Tuesday morning in Cleveland didn't just blow, it bit. It was a wet, heavy cold that settled into the bones and refused to leave, much like the grief hanging over the small group gathered at the Riverside Cemetery. The sky was the color of a bruised plum, threatening snow that hadn't yet fallen, trapping the city in a suspended state of gray misery. Dorothy Murphy stood by the open grave, her small frame trembling not from the cold, but from the kind of exhaustion that only a mother burying her child can understand. At 72, she looked fragile, wrapped in a black wool coat that had seen better decades, the fabric thinning at the elbows. Her hands, rough and calloused from 50 years of scrubbing other people's floors, clutched a damp tissue as if it were a lifeline. She wasn't crying anymore. She had run out of tears days ago. Now, there was just a hollow silence inside her, a void where her son Thomas used to be. Thomas had been her world, a good boy, a hard worker. He was only 34. The casket looked too small, too final against the muddy Ohio earth. Around Dorothy, a dozen neighbors from the working-class district of Slavic Village huddled together. They were good people, honest people, wearing their Sunday best on a Tuesday, their faces etched with the shared resignation of those who are used to life taking more than it gives. Standing slightly apart from the main group, under the shelter of an old oak tree stripped bare by winter, was Dr. Arthur Vance. He didn't fit in, though he tried to. While the others wore ill-fitting suits or worn-out jackets, Arthur's charcoal overcoat was tailored to perfection, his posture relaxed yet alert. He wasn't family. He was a friend of a friend, someone who had met Thomas briefly at a community center volunteer event years ago, but Arthur wasn't there just to pay respects. Arthur Vance was a behaviorist, a man who had spent 20 years studying the microscopic portrayals of the human face. He read people the way others read billboards. To him, the world wasn't made of words. It was made of twitches, pupil dilations, and shifts in weight. He was watching Dorothy with deep compassion, noting the slump of her shoulders, a sign of total defeat, not just sadness. Then the atmosphere shifted. The sound of gravel crunching under heavy tires broke the respectful silence. Every head turned. A sleek, obsidian black Mercedes-Benz S-Class, a car that cost more than any house in Dorothy's neighborhood, rolled slowly up the narrow cemetery path. It looked like a predator gliding through dark water. The engine purred with a low, expensive hum before cutting off. The driver's door didn't open. Instead, the back door swung wide. A man stepped out, and immediately the energy of the funeral changed from mourning to confusion. He was tall, silver-haired, immaculate. Richard Ashton. Even without knowing his name, you knew his status. He wore a cashmere coat that repelled the damp air, leather gloves that looked like they had never touched a dirty surface, and a pair of rimless glasses that caught the dull light. He paused for a moment, surveying the scene, adjusting his scarf with a practiced motion. Arthur Vance narrowed his eyes. His internal radar pinged. Why is he pausing? Arthur thought. That's not hesitation, that's assessment. He's checking the audience size. Richard walked toward the grave with a somber expression plastered on his face. It was a good performance. His head was bowed just enough to suggest humility, his stride measured. But Arthur saw what the grieving neighbors missed. Richard's stride was too rhythmic. A truly grieving person has an irregular gait, weighed down by emotional burden. Richard walked with the efficiency of a man entering a boardroom. Dorothy looked up, her eyes red-rimmed and confused. She didn't know this man. Mrs. Murphy. Richard's voice was a rich baritone, smooth as aged whiskey. He stopped 3 feet from her, respecting the personal space, but dominating the interaction. Yes, Dorothy's voice was a cracked whisper. My name is Richard Ashton. he said, taking off his gloves to reveal manicured hands. He reached out and took Dorothy's rough hand in his. I am devastated. I only heard the news this morning. I came as fast as I could. A murmur went through the small crowd. Richard Ashton, the hotel magnate. Everyone in Cleveland knew the name. It was on half the skyscrapers downtown. You knew my Thomas? Dorothy asked, hope flickering in her eyes. The desperate hope of a mother wanting to know her son mattered to important people. Knew him. Richard let out a soft, sad chuckle, shaking his head. Dorothy, Thomas wasn't just an employee to me. He was like a son. We spent hours talking about his dreams, about his future. He was one of the finest young men I have ever had the privilege of knowing. Arthur Vance took a step closer, his gaze locking onto Richard's face like a laser. The mentalist in him went to work. Freeze frame. Arthur analyzed the statement. He was like a son. As Richard said the word son, his left shoulder rose slightly, a unilateral shrug. In the lexicon of body language, a single shoulder shrug, while stating a fact, is a screaming siren of contradiction. It means the body doesn't believe what the mouth is saying. Richard continued, he spoke of you constantly, Dorothy. He told me how you worked 2 jobs to raise him. He wanted to give you the world. Dorothy began to sob, her knees buckling. Richard caught her, steadying her with the appearance of immense strength and comfort. I am so sorry, he whispered. Arthur watched Richard's eyes. They were dry. Not just dry of tears, but the surrounding muscles, the orbita florocularis, are completely relaxed. When a human being feels genuine empathy, the inner corners of the eyebrows pull up and together. It's a muscle movement that is nearly impossible to fake consciously. Richard's eyebrows were flat. His forehead was smooth. He was simulating sadness with his mouth, pulling the corners down, but his eyes were dead. He was a mask. Why are you lying? Arthur whispered to himself, the steam of his breath vanishing in the cold air. What do you want from her? The scene was heartbreaking. The poor mother clinging to the rich stranger, finding solace in a fabrication. It is a cruel reality of our world that we often accept the lies that make us feel less alone, rather than facing the silence of truth. If you've ever felt that something wasn't quite right about a situation but couldn't put your finger on it, or if you believe that the truth always has a way of revealing itself, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and like this video. It helps us bring these deep hidden stories to light. Now, back to the cemetery, where the deception was about to escalate. Richard Ashton wasn't done. He signaled to his driver, who had been standing by the car like a statue. The driver approached, carrying a thick, cream-colored envelope and a sleek leather folder. Dorothy, Richard said, his voice rising slightly to ensure the neighbors could hear him. I know nothing can replace Thomas. But he was worried about his niece. Your granddaughter, Sarah. Dorothy nodded, wiping her face. Little Sarah, She's all I have left now. Thomas told me she wants to be a nurse, Richard said, taking the leather folder. I don't want you to worry about that ever again. This is a full scholarship to the Case Western Reserve University nursing program, fully paid. Tuition, books, housing, everything. Gasps erupted from the small crowd. The neighbors looked at each other, stunned. This was a winning lottery ticket. This was salvation. And this, Richard handed her the thick envelope, is a check for $100,000. It's a donation in Thomas's name, for you, to ensure you never have to scrub another floor in your life. Dorothy stared at the envelope. Her hands shook so violently she almost dropped it. She looked at Richard, as if he were the Archangel Gabriel himself descending from the grey clouds. Mr. Ashton, I don't know what to say. God bless you. Oh, God bless you, sir. She threw her arms around him. The crowd broke into tears. A woman in the back shouted, "Praise the Lord!" It was a perfect moment, a moment of divine intervention. Except for Arthur Vance, Arthur was watching Richard's neck. Specifically, the suprasternal notch, a hollow at the base of the throat. As Dorothy hugged him, Richard's hand patted her back. Pat, pat, pat. A rhythmic, quick tempo. He wants to let go, Arthur analyzed. That's not comfort, that's impatience. He's timing the hug to end it as quickly as socially acceptable. But the most damning signal came when Richard pulled away. For a split second, less than a blink of an eye, Richard looked over Dorothy's shoulder at the headstone. Arthur saw it clearly. A micro-expression of disgust. Richard's upper lip curled upward on the left side, and his nose wrinkled. It lasted maybe 0.4 seconds before the mask of benevolent billionaire slid back into place. But Arthur had seen it. Why would a man giving away a fortune feel disgust toward the deceased friend? "You are a saint, Mr. Ashton," Dorothy cried, clutching the check to her chest. "No, Dorothy," Richard said, buttoning his coat, preparing to leave. "Thomas was the saint. I'm just doing what's right." "How long did you say you knew him?" Arthur's voice cut through the emotional fog like a scalpel. The question hung in the air. It wasn't loud, but it was projected with a specific frequency that demanded attention. The neighbors turned to look at Arthur. Dorothy looked confused. Richard Ashton froze for a fraction of a second, a hesitation, a stop-start reaction, before slowly turning his head toward the man in the charcoal coat. Richard smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I'm sorry, I don't believe we've met." "Arthur Vance," Arthur said, stepping forward, his hands relaxed at his sides, palms open, a gesture of non-aggression, designed to lower the other person's guard while probing for data. "I was a friend of the family. I was just asking, hearing such beautiful stories." "How long did you know Thomas?" Richard sized Arthur up. He saw the quality of Arthur's coat, the intelligence in his eyes. He realized this wasn't a neighbor he could dazzle with money. This was a peer, a threat. "Oh, quite some time," Richard said smoothly. 3, maybe 4 years. He did contract work for several of my properties." "Lie." Arthur caught it instantly. When Richard said 3, maybe 4 years, his eyes darted up and to the right. In neuro-linguistic programming, looking up and to the right indicates visual construction. He was creating an image in his brain, not recalling a memory. If he were remembering, he would have looked up and to the left. Furthermore, Richard's blink rate spiked. A normal person blinks about 15 to 20 times a minute. In the 10 seconds since Arthur asked the question, Richard had blinked 6 times. His autonomic nervous system was spiking. Adrenaline, cortisol, the body's reaction to the fear of being caught. "That's fascinating," Arthur said, his voice calm, almost bored. "Thomas was a quiet man. He rarely mentioned work." "Did he work at the downtown location, to Grand Ashton?" Richard adjusted his glasses, a self-soothing gesture, a barrier created between him and the questioner. Yes, mostly downtown. "Look, Mr. Vance, I would love to chat, but I have a board meeting. I just wanted to pay my respects." "Of course," Arthur nodded. "Generosity like yours is rare. It almost seems ... compensatory." Richard stiffened. The color drained slightly from his cheeks. The word compensatory had hit a nerve. His jaw muscle clenched, the masseter muscle bulging beneath the skin. He was angry, but beneath the anger, Arthur detected something else. Fear, pure, primal fear. "I don't know what you're implying," Richard said, his voice dropping an octave, becoming colder. "But this woman has just received a future for her family. I suggest you don't spoil it with cynicism." Richard turned abruptly, dismissing Arthur. He gave Dorothy one last stiff nod. "Take care, Dorothy. My secretary will contact you about the transfer details." He walked back to the Mercedes. He didn't walk with the somber grace he had arrived with. He walked faster. His stride was longer. He was fleeing. As the heavy car door slammed shut and the Mercedes pulled away, spraying slush onto the cemetery grass, the neighbors surrounded Dorothy, celebrating the miracle. They were touching the check, crying, thanking God. But Arthur stood alone, watching the taillights of the Mercedes disappear into the grey mist. The wind picked up, howling through the bare branches of the oak tree. Something was wrong, terribly, violently wrong. Men like Richard Ashton didn't become billionaires by giving away money to the mothers of random employees. They didn't show up at funerals in Slavic village unless they had a reason, and Richard's body language screamed that the reason wasn't charity. It was damage control. Arthur replayed the mental tape of the interaction. The unilateral shrug, the lack of eye crinkles, the visual construction, eye movement, the micro-expression of disgust, the jaw clench at the word compensatory. Richard Ashton hadn't loved Thomas Murphy. He hadn't even liked him. In fact, Arthur suspected Richard was afraid of Thomas, or rather, afraid of what Thomas represented. Arthur walked over to the funeral director, a small, balding man who was busy packing up the lowering device for the casket. "Excuse me," Arthur said softly. The director looked up. "Yes, sir?" "The deceased ... Thomas. Do you have the death certificate on file, or the cause of death listed for the obituary?" "It was an accident, sir," the director said, lowering his voice respectfully. "Tragic, construction site accident. Fall from height, blunt force trauma." "Where?" Arthur asked. "Where did it happen?" "A site over on the west side, some new luxury condo development." "Why?" "Just curious," Arthur said. He pulled out his smartphone. He searched for Ashton Properties New Developments, Cleveland. The first result: Ashton Heights, luxury condos coming soon to West Side. Arthur felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter weather. Thomas died on Richard's construction site. But Richard had said Thomas worked at the hotel. Why lie about where he worked? Why lie about the timeline? Arthur looked back at Dorothy. She was clutching that check like it was a shield against the world. She looked happier than she had in years. To take that away from her would be cruel, but to let her live a lie that might be covering up the very reason her son was in that box, ... that would be a sin. Arthur knew he had to be sure. He needed more than micro-expressions. He needed hard data. He needed to know exactly what happened on that construction site. And he needed to know it before Richard Ashton's money bought silence forever. He walked over to Dorothy. "Mrs. Murphy," he said gently. She looked up, beaming through her tears. "Oh, Mr. Vance, can you believe it? Thomas. He's looking out for us from heaven. He sent that man." Arthur forced a smile. It was painful. "It's a wonderful gift, Dorothy. Listen, I need to go take care of some things. But I'll be checking in on you, okay? You're a good man, Arthur." She patted his cheek. Arthur turned and walked away, his boots crunching on the frozen ground. He wasn't a good man. He was a man obsessed with the truth, and the truth was often ugly. He reached his own car, a modest sedan, and sat inside. He didn't start the engine immediately. He sat in the silence, watching the snow finally begin to fall. He pulled out his phone and dialed a number. "Yeah?" a gruff voice answered. It was Detective Miller, an old contact from the Cleveland PD, who owed Arthur a favor for helping with a hostage negotiation the year before. "Miller, it's Vance. I need you to pull a file for me. An accident report. 2 months ago. Thomas Murphy, construction site fatality." "Vance, I can't just... It's important." "Miller, I think a billionaire just paid $100,000 to cover up a murder." There was silence on the other end of the line. Then, "I'll call you back in 10. Arthur hung up. He watched the snow covering the windshield, burying the world in white. Richard Ashton thought he could bury the truth under money and snow. He thought he could act his way out of guilt, but he had made one fatal mistake. He had performed his play in front of the one man in Cleveland who could see the strings. Arthur started the car. The engine roared to life. The hunt was on. Arthur Vance drove through the darkening streets of Cleveland, the wipers of his sedan fighting a losing battle against the intensifying snow. The city lights blurred into streaks of amber and red, reflecting the chaotic map of thoughts in his mind. He wasn't going home. He was heading to the one place where the truth couldn't be painted over. The Rusty Nail, a dive bar on the west side, where construction workers gathered to wash away the dust and aches of the day with cheap beer. His phone buzzed on the passenger seat. Detective Miller. Arthur answered on the first ring, putting it on speaker. "Tell me, you have a nose for trouble, Vance." Miller's voice crackled, sounding tired. "I pulled the report. It's weird." "Define weird," Arthur said, his eyes scanning the road, his mind already constructing scenarios. "The official cause of death is accidental fall due to worker negligence. Says Murphy wasn't wearing his harness properly. Case closed. OSHA signed off. Insurance paid out the minimum. Worker negligence." Arthur repeated, the words tasting like ash. Thomas was meticulous. He color-coded his spice rack. Miller. He didn't forget safety harnesses. "Here's the kicker," Miller continued. "The witness statements. There were 3 guys on the scaffold with him. All 3 gave identical statements. Word for word." Thomas slipped. He wasn't clipped in, he fell. "It reads like a script." Identical phrasing. Arthur's grip on the steering wheel tightened. That's statistically impossible in natural recall. People remember trauma in fragments, different angles. If they're using the same words, they were coached. "There's one more thing." Miller hesitated. "The foreman on that job? Guy named Frank Russo. He quit 2 days after the accident. Bought a boat. Moved to Florida." "Of course he did," Arthur whispered. "Thanks, Miller. Be careful, Arthur. Ashton has friends in high places, even in the precinct." Arthur hung up as he pulled into the gravel lot of the Rusty Nail. The neon sign buzzed with an irritating flicker. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of stale hops and fried grease. He scanned the room. He wasn't looking for Frank Russo. Frank was gone. He was looking for the guilt. He spotted a group of men in high-vis jackets in a corner booth. They were loud, laughing too hard. But one man at the end of the table wasn't laughing. He was staring into his beer, his shoulders hunched up to his ears, the turtle effect, a subconscious attempt to hide, to disappear. Arthur ordered a beer he didn't intend to drink and moved toward the booth. He didn't approach aggressively. He approached from the side, avoiding direct frontal confrontation, slipping into the man's peripheral vision. "Rough day?" Arthur asked, sliding onto the stool next to the man. The worker looked up. He was young, maybe 25. His eyes were bloodshot. "How are you?" "Just a guy who hates seeing a good man drink alone," Arthur said. He noticed the man's hands. He was twisting a paper napkin into tiny, tight shreds. Displacement activity. High anxiety. "I'm fine," the kid muttered. "You don't look fine. You look like a man carrying something heavy." Arthur kept his voice low, hypnotic, like a secret. The kid flinched. A micro-expression of fear flashed across his face, eyebrows raised, lips stretched horizontally. "I don't know what you're talking about. I was at Thomas Murphy's funeral today," Arthur said softly. The reaction was visceral. The kid knocked his beer over. The amber liquid pooled on the table, dripping onto the floor. The other men at the table stopped laughing and looked over. "Hey buddy, you got a problem?" One of the older workers barked. Arthur ignored him. He locked eyes with the kid. Richard Ashton was there. He gave Thomas's mother a lot of money. He said Thomas was like a son to him. The kid let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. A son. That bastard didn't even know Thomas's name until he started organizing the strike. Strike. The missing piece. Thomas was organizing a union. Arthur pressed, leaning in. "Not a union," the kid whispered, looking terrified. "A safety walkout. The scaffolding. It was rusted, man. The clips were faulty. We told Russo. He said fix it or get fired. Thomas wouldn't let it go. He was going to report it to the city. And then he fell," Arthur finished. The kid looked around, panic rising in his chest. He leaned in close to Arthur, his breath smelling of cheap whiskey and fear. He didn't just fall. I saw it. I was 10 feet away. Russo. He was up there arguing with him. Thomas was clipped in. I saw him clip in. Russo shoved him. He shoved him, and the railing gave way because it wasn't secured. Thomas didn't slip. He was pushed. Arthur felt a cold fury settle in his gut. It wasn't negligence. It wasn't an accident. It was manslaughter covered up by a billionaire who couldn't afford a safety inspection, delaying his grand opening. "Why didn't you tell the police?" Arthur asked. "Russo told us. He said if we talked, we'd be blacklisted, or worse." Then Ashton's lawyers came. They gave us $5,000 each to sign the statement. "I needed the money, man. My wife, she's pregnant." Tears streamed down the kid's face. Arthur placed a hand on the kid's shoulder. "What's your name?" "Dave. Dave Miller." "Dave, you're going to have to be brave. For Thomas. For his mother." Arthur left the bar with Dave's contact info and a recording of the conversation on his phone. The snow was falling harder now, a white curtain hiding the city's sins. But Arthur saw everything clearly. The next morning, Arthur stood outside the glass and steel tower of Ashton Enterprises. He wasn't there to protest, he was there to hunt. He waited until Richard Ashton's limousine pulled up. Richard stepped out, surrounded by a phalanx of security and assistants. He looked powerful, untouchable. Then he saw Arthur leaning against a lamppost, looking calm, almost bored. Richard stopped. He said something to his security, who stepped back. He walked over to Arthur, his face a mask of polite irritation. "Mr. Vance," Richard said, "are you stalking me?" "I'm observing," Arthur corrected. "I find your behavior fascinating, Richard. Can I call you Richard? You can call me Mr. Ashton, and you can hear from my lawyers if you don't leave." "I spoke to Dave Miller last night," Arthur said. The effect was instantaneous. Richard's face went pale. His pupils constricted to pinpoints, the fight or flight response kicking in. He didn't ask, "Who is Dave Miller?" He knew. "I don't know any Dave Miller," Richard said, but his voice cracked on the last syllable. A vocal fry, a sign of immense throat tension. "He told me about the railing," Arthur continued, relentless. "He told me about Rousseau, and he told me about the $5,000. Richard stepped closer, invading Arthur's personal space. His veneer of civility vanished. His face twisted into a snarl. "You have nothing. The word of a drunk laborer against a pillar of the community. I'll bury you. I'll bury that old woman in legal fees until she begs for mercy." "There it is," Arthur smiled cold. "The real Richard. I was wondering when you'd show up." "You think you're smart," Richard hissed. "You're a nobody. I gave that woman a fortune. She's happy. Why destroy that? Why hurt her with the truth? Because the truth is the only thing that heals," Arthur said. "Lies are just anesthesia. They wear off. Walk away, Vance, or you'll end up like Thomas." Richard turned and marched into his building. A direct threat. Arthur didn't flinch. He had what he needed. He had seen the monster behind the mask. Now he needed to arm the victim. The hardest part wasn't confronting the killer. It was breaking the heart of the mother. Arthur sat in Dorothy's small living room that afternoon. The house smelled of lavender and old paper. The check for $100,000 was framed on the mantelpiece, next to a photo of Thomas. Dorothy was making tea, humming a hymn. She looked 10 years younger than she had at the cemetery. "Dorothy," Arthur said, his voice heavy, "we need to talk." She turned, smiling. "About the scholarship. Sarah is so excited. About Richard Ashton." Arthur laid it all out. He didn't sugarcoat it. He told her about the hotel job that was actually a construction site. He told her about the safety violations. He told her about the bribe disguised as charity. He played the recording of Dave Miller's confession. As he spoke, he watched Dorothy crumble. It was like watching a building implode in slow motion. Her smile faded, replaced by confusion, then denial, then a horror so deep it seemed to stop her heart. "No," she whispered, clutching the counter. "No, he was so kind. He cried with me. "He didn't cry, Dorothy," Arthur said gently. "He performed. He bought your silence with blood money. My boy, ... double quotes. She sank into a chair, burying her face in her hands. "He killed my boy? His negligence did, and his cover-up denied Thomas's justice." Dorothy looked at the framed check, the paper that promised salvation. She stood up, walked over to the mantelpiece, and took the frame down. Her hands were shaking, but not with weakness this time, with rage. "He thinks he can buy my son." Her voice started as a whisper and rose to a scream. "He thinks my Thomas is worth a piece of paper." She smashed the frame against the floor. Glass shattered everywhere. She ripped the check into pieces, her breathing ragged. "I want him to pay," she sobbed. "Not with money. I want him to say his name. I want him to admit what he did." "He will," Arthur promised. "I'll make sure of it." The legal battle was brutal. Richard Ashton threw everything he had at them: high-priced legal teams, media smear campaigns, intimidation tactics. But he hadn't counted on two things: the unshakable resolve of a mother seeking justice, and the terrifying precision of Arthur Vance. During the deposition, Arthur sat as a consultant for the pro bono legal team. He guided the questioning. "Ask him about the meeting on the 14th, Arthur would whisper. "Watch his left hand. When it twitches, press harder." Arthur deconstructed Richard's testimony in real time. When Richard lied about the safety reports, Arthur signaled the lawyers. They produced the emails Arthur had helped uncover through a whistleblower. When Richard feigned ignorance about Rousseau, they produced the flight records paid for by Ashton Corp. The turning point came in the courtroom. Richard was on the stand, confident, arrogant. The lawyer asked, "Mr. Ashton, did you order Frank Rousseau to ignore the safety protocols?" "Absolutely not," Richard said, looking at the jury. Arthur leaned forward. He saw it, a tiny, almost imperceptible swallow, a gulping motion, and a micro-expression of fear, the lower eyelids tensing. Arthur passed a note to the lawyer. "Ask him about the voicemail." There was no voicemail. It was a bluff, a mentalist's gambit. "Mr. Ashton," the lawyer said, holding up a blank USB drive. "We have a voicemail from Frank Rousseau's phone. Would you like to amend your statement before we play it?" Richard stared at the drive. His confidence evaporated. His mind raced. What did Rousseau record? Did he betray me? The silence stretched. The jury watched. Richard started to sweat. He tugged at his collar. I might have said ... double quotes, Richard stammered. "I told him to get the job done. Time was money." "Did you tell him to ignore the safety clips?" "I told him not to let regulations slow us down," Richard shouted, snapping. The courtroom gasped. The mask had fallen. The verdict was swift: negligence, wrongful death, attempted obstruction of justice. The jury awarded Dorothy Murphy $2 million in damages. But the money wasn't the victory. The victory was the handcuffs. As Richard Ashton was led out of the courtroom, stripped of his expensive suit and his dignity, he looked back. He found Arthur Vance in the gallery. Richard's eyes were full of hate. Arthur's eyes were calm. He gave Richard a single, slow nod. "I read you." 6 months later, spring had finally come to Cleveland. The gray sky was replaced by a brilliant, piercing blue. The cemetery was green, alive with blooming dogwoods. Dorothy Murphy stood by Thomas's grave. The headstone was new, polished granite. It didn't just list his dates. It read, "Thomas Murphy, beloved son." He stood for truth. She wasn't wearing the old wool coat. She wore a simple, elegant dress. She looked peaceful. The hollow void inside her was still there, always would be, but it wasn't filled with lies anymore. It was filled with pride. Arthur stood a few feet away, respecting her moment. "You know," Dorothy said, touching the cold stone, "I thought that money was a miracle. I thought God sent it." "God works in mysterious ways," Arthur said. Sometimes the miracle isn't the gift, it's the truth that destroys the gift. Sarah got into nursing school. Dorothy smiled, turning to him. She got a scholarship on her own merit. And, with the settlement, we're going to start a foundation for workplace safety to help other families. Thomas would be proud, Arthur said. He is, she whispered. I can feel him. She walked over to Arthur and took his hand. Her grip was strong. Thank you, Arthur. You saw what no one else could see. I just watched, Arthur said, humble. You were the one who fought. You saw the lie, she corrected. But you also saw the truth in me, that I could handle it. Arthur watched her walk away, back to her car, back to her life, a life that was no longer defined by a rich man's pity, but by her own strength. He looked back at the grave one last time. The wind rustled the leaves, sounding like a whisper. Arthur smiled, buttoned his coat, and walked away. The world was full of liars, full of masks. But as long as there were people willing to look closely, to really see, the truth would always find a way to the surface. And for a mentalist, that was the only story worth telling. If this story of justice and revelation moved you, if you believe that the truth is worth fighting for, no matter the cost, please leave a comment below sharing a time you uncovered a lie. Subscribe to the channel for more stories that peel back the layers of human behavior and reveal the raw, beating heart beneath. Like this video and share it with someone who needs to know that even the powerful can fall when the truth stands tall. Until next time, keep watching.